Hello everyone, on behalf of the Gender Balance Network of # Australia, I'm delighted to welcome you to this very special International Women's Day event with Gemma Hartley, author of the sensational Fed Up. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. The theme of this year's International Women's Day is Balance for Better. So we are very lucky to have Gemma with us today, as she has grappled with and articulated so well why so many women feel completely off balance, with lives out of control and far too many balls to juggle. Gemma is a feminist journalist, and her Harper's Bazaar article, Women Aren't Nags, We're Just Fed Up, went viral and was viewed over 2 billion times. The response prompted Gemma to expand on her re-examination of the term emotional labour and how the mental load that women carry in the modern age is adversely affecting their lives. She lives with her husband, 3 children, a cat and a dog, which is just one too many. Welcome to Sydney, Gemma.
Thank you.
Perhaps you can talk a little bit about the kind of things that women do in the home that can generate that feeling.
Yeah, I think there's so much that falls under the definition of emotional labor as I have it. And the thing is, it's really hard to, there's obviously like the lists that we've got, but that list that we're keeping is generally in our head. Like, it's not written down anywhere, and we're constantly keeping track of things that we know no one else is keeping track of. And so because the work is so invisible, it can be really hard to broach the topic and to figure out what's wrong when things feel off balance in your relationship. And so I think, when I think about emotional labor, I think about being the one who is responsible for all of that worry and all of the things that will keep everyone in the home happy.
Worrying is a really good word for it.
Yeah, there's a wonderful article that was written a few years back called Mom, the Designated Worrier, and it should really just be like women, the designated warriors, because there's so much that we're keeping track of all the time to make sure that everything runs smoothly. It's a lot of worry work.
So before we get to motherhood, I wanted to talk a little bit about romance, because I think your take on romance is really interesting, particularly big romantic gestures. Can we talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I talk a lot about courtship as a time where you'll see a lot more even distribution of emotional labor, because oftentimes during that period, men are willing to put in a lot more emotional labor as a gesture of good faith, and also as a way to get the girl, which is a term that I don't love, but I think it's really apt in this situation, whereas women perform emotional labor as a way of being. It's expected of us no matter what. And so there's, a point where men are no longer expected to do emotional labor, where they're no longer expected to, anticipate needs and show these big gestures in the same way that women are.
Which leads us beautifully to motherhood, which is when I became very conscious about emotional labor. Before that, it was really, even though I didn't know the term, it wasn't really on my radar, because having a child does change everything. It's lovely. It's really, really wonderful experience, but it does change everything. Why is motherhood so hard today? Why do we make it so hard on ourselves?
Oh, that's a loaded question. There's so many reasons. I think one of the big switches in the emotional load that we're carrying and the mental load that we're carrying when we have children is that at least I know in the US, women don't have paid maternity leave at all.
Yeah, it's shocking, actually.
Yeah. And men definitely don't have paternity leave. So usually, mom's the one at home with the baby, and there's no one else around. So you're learning all of those things. You're learning what you need to keep track of and what you need to worry about. And it's easier in a way to, not fill your partner in and just delegate out all of the things as needed. And so I think a really big gap develops right at the beginning, because there aren't, both partners at home doing this work, doing this care work. And while that shifts as children get older, you've already got that role and that expectation going on. And so I think women tend to be the ones that, know the kids' schedules, know what needs to be done, and just delegating seems easier in the short term, because then you don't have to, have someone else learn it from scratch like you did.
And I think there's an assumption that we're the experts
Yes.
at raising children.
Of course, there's that, the biological determinism that women are meant to be nurturers, that we're meant to be, more caring and more, more attuned to the emotional needs of our children, which I think it's a load of rubbish, because when I had my first child, I was like, there's something wrong with me. I don't have any motherly intuition. I have no idea why this kid is crying, and I'm like, I'm going to lose my mind. And there was that expectation that, no, you're the one that's supposed to have this deep, connection.
Earth
that's going,
mother.
yeah, you're supposed to have that earth mother connection to your child, and you're supposed to intuitively know what they need. And I'm like, nope. I don't have it. And, when my husband didn't have it, that was no big deal. It's like, well, of course he doesn't have it. He's not the one that's, connected in that earth mother way. And I'm like, I don't think either of us have that. I really need him to learn that skill also.
So you needed him to actually read the books and step up.
to read the baby books, to really pay attention to what was going on throughout the whole process. And also, our systems are not set up to expect fathers to step into that role in a big way. I talk in the book about when I had my first child. It was a very difficult birth, and I had to have a lot of interventions, and I was just in a haze afterwards. And when nurses and doctors would come into the room, they would speak to me. And my husband was sitting right there, and I'm like, he has all his faculties right now, and I do not. Can you please relay this information to him? I don't need to be the one that is, writing down when I last breastfed or when the baby last had his diaper changed, because I am recovering from a really traumatic experience right now. But they were like, no, you're a mom, you're the one that needs to know all of this. He's not gonna do it. And I'm just like, no, he needs to be. But of course I didn't say anything, because my role as a woman is to keep everyone around me comfortable and happy. And so I'm just like, well, if they're telling me that this is what I need to do, I'm not gonna put up a fight. I'm not gonna disrupt this system, which I wouldn't do today, but at the time I was very young and it was very overwhelming.
There's also, and you do mention this in your book as well, when a dad picks up the kids from school, oh, isn't he fantastic? How amazing that he made time in his busy day. And then, I rock up and I'm really excited to rock up at the school pickup because I never get to do it. And it's like, oh yeah, normal.
Yeah, there's a big double standard in what we expect from parents. And it's really, my husband takes the kids out a lot, and he's like, man, it's it can slow you down having so many people that need to come up and pat your back and tell you what a fantastic job you're doing as a dad while you're trying to grocery shop with 3 young kids. But there's this, expectation that that's what women do. So when men do it, it's extraordinary. And I think that's really harmful for so many reasons. One of which is my husband's like, no, I'm not a good dad because I'm taking them to the store. He's a good dad in his own right. He's a good parent in his own right. And to have the bar set so low is really disappointing for fathers who want to be involved and want to be equal partners with their spouses.
Absolutely. So your husband, Rob, does feature quite heavily in the book. Yes. Brave man.
Yes. He's got a thick skin.
And so how did you work with Rob to balance the load at home? Because obviously he had to learn a lot as well, didn't he?
Yeah, I mean, these aren't skills that we teach men from an early age. This is something that we place entirely on women. So it's hard for men, first of all, to see this work when you've been socially conditioned not to. And then, to learn these skills from scratch, when you're comparing yourself to someone who's been doing it, all of their life, that's really hard. That's a really steep learning curve. And so I think what happened was he got laid off from work at the same time I got my book deal, and that worked out really well for the writing of this book. I could not have asked for better timing. But it really threw us into this time where we had to figure out very quickly how to rebalance and how to recalibrate. And him being at home full time really allowed him to step into this role where he could start to see all of the invisible stuff that normally needed to be taken care of. Because while I was writing this book and I had like a 6-month deadline on it, I had to step back and I had to do my work and not worry about what was happening. And so he had to, you know, sort of take the reins and learn how to make it work. And that was a really transformative experience, I think, for both of us, both in me needing to like give up that control in a way, and also for him, you know, to feel confident that this is a skill that, you know, isn't innate, it's learned. And so he was perfectly capable of learning. And I think he's got a lot more confidence, you know, within the home now and as a parent, because he's done all of that work.
And so it's been a rewarding kind of journey for both of you.
Yeah, and I think one of the most rewarding things, you know, beyond having a lot more mental space and emotional space now because he's taking on his share of the load, we've got a really good understanding of each other and what our lives are like. I think one of the big things that causes the resentment and the anger is that we do this work and no one is seeing it and no one is acknowledging it, and you feel like this really massive part of your life is invisible to your partner. And that's just such a demoralizing experience. And so just having that validation, knowing that he sees what I'm doing even when he doesn't like see it, you know, physically, it's really good for us to know that we have someone who is on our side and that understands our lived experience, even if they're not the ones doing it all the time.
Well, it's very exciting, actually.
Yeah, it is. It's good. It's hopeful.
Can you give us some examples of emotional labour in the workplace and how we can recognise it, particularly in such a female-dominated workforce, and how we can correct any imbalance at work?
Yes. So I've worked in a lot of like female-dominated jobs in my life, and I think one of the wonderful things about it is that everyone's really skilled at emotional labor. And so everyone sort of recognizes each other's work, is really grateful and appreciative, which we don't get a lot at home. And I think one of the big things that I've heard at work is like emails are a huge thing. We have to perfectly and carefully word our emails so it's not too, you know, too sharp or too bossy or too straight to the point. We've got to make sure that it's keeping everyone comfortable and happy. Another example that I hear a lot is that women are asked to take notes in meetings by men who are their peers or their juniors even. And there's just this expectation that women are going to put forth that really nurturing extra step in work that men are not expected to do naturally. So I think that's really something to be aware of, to make sure that we're holding everyone to the same standard, because I don't think, you know, that emotional labor is necessarily bad. I think it's a really good skill that everyone should have. And so I think that that's more what we need to focus on, is making sure everyone has these skills, and that we aren't putting this double standard up for men and women in the workplace.
That's very much about balance, which is perfectly themed for today.
Yeah.
How is emotional labour holding women back? Can redressing the imbalance move the dial on issues around women in leadership, closing the gender pay gap? Do you think it has a place in driving change in those areas?
I absolutely do. I think that the demand for women's emotional labor holds us back in a really big variety of ways. There's the emotional labor that we're expected to do at home, which pulls us from our offices quite often, because we always have to be on call. And then there is the demand for our emotional labor in the workplace, which is also often distracting us from reaching the same level of focused work that our male peers can sometimes get. And so I think that, you know, changing that expectation for whose job emotional labor is will really change how we view female leaders and male leaders, and put us on an equal, you know, an equal space there. Because I think that's a huge part of the problem with, you know, especially in the US, I've been looking a lot at, we've got, you know, elections are for quite a while, but we've got quite a few female candidates that are throwing their hats in the ring. And the amount of scrutiny that they are under in comparison to the men who've joined is just unreal. We are not holding everyone to the same standard, and that is holding women back.
That's shocking. And reading about, we saw an article about how many hours Hillary Clinton had to spend doing her hair and makeup during the presidential campaign, all of that kind of stuff, which is a different kind of labour in a way, isn't it?
Yes, but
horrific.
Also it's part of that, because she can't go out there with no makeup and no hair done and keep everyone comfortable and happy with her appearance. She worked with a voice coach to make sure that her voice was hitting the right pitch. I mean, really, talk about tone policing. To have to go to those kind of lengths and then to still be met with so much hostility, simply for the fact that you are a woman in politics. That's, she's a really strong example of how much emotional labor we expect from women, and how when you're talking about leadership, especially leadership at that level, there's almost no amount of emotional labor that will suffice. Hopefully that changes.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I want to change it before my daughter gets there and is Prime Minister of Australia. The feminist movement is often accused of an agenda driven by predominantly white Western women, and you talk a little bit in your book about the emotional labour of women of colour being even greater. Can you talk a little bit about that from an American perspective?
Yes. So I think, when I'm approaching the book and my personal experiences, it pales in comparison to the amount of emotional labor demanded from women who are of a different socioeconomic class and women of different races. There is so much more that we place societally on women of color, especially in regards to our expectations of them, and our expectations of them as mothers. In particular, a lot of my research focused on how we really expect in the U.S. Black women to be the cornerstone of their community, to raise up everyone around them, and to do the emotional labor also of kind of explaining their humanity to the world. One thing that I see a lot is that women of color tend to have to put in a lot of emotional labor in their day-to-day just to make everyone around them feel comfortable about their race. And they are having to be better than everyone else in order to get ahead. And that is not just in their emotional labor, but in all of their labor. With me, if I'm doing well at work and not making anyone comfortable, I can probably get away with it. A Black woman would never be able to get away with that. And so I think we hold them to a higher standard than we do anyone else.
So there's a long way to go.
There's a super long way to go. And I think, there's a lot also when we're talking about race, and we're talking about racism a lot in the US right now. And we're making really slow progress, a lot because of white women and white feminism, and asking Black women to hold our hands and to make us feel comfortable. And I think we really got to stop that, because we're not going to make any progress if we're constantly, centering white feelings above the feelings of Black women. I think they are the ones that need to lead change rather than us, because we haven't been doing a great job. Our track record is not spotless.
Indeed. So when we're thinking about emotional labour, the first step is obviously recognising the problem, which thanks to you, nearly 2 billion of us have. What's next? How do we create better balance in our society? How do we raise our children differently? How do already raised men, we talked about Rob a little bit, make a change? And how do women stop carrying the load, that fear of everything becoming a complete mess?
That's a big one. How do we change the world? Let's see. Where should we start? So I think with writing this book, I really wanted to start with our personal relationships, because I think that's where it's going to be easiest. That's where I see the easy in, when we're talking about toppling, systems that have been in place for decades, hundreds of years, we're going to have a lot more trouble if we're trying to start there. So I think really it starts at home with, balancing things out with your partner, making sure that the next generation is seeing what equal balance of emotional labor looks like. And I think there is a lot that we can change culturally and politically. I would need a lot more research to figure out exactly what that was, both here and in the US. But there are a lot of changes that I think we can make once we stop putting this expectation solely onto women. And I think that, a lot of people ask me, like, how do we start these conversations? How do we find the perfect words to, ask our partner to take on their load of emotional labor? And I think what's really key to keep in mind is that men who want to be a part of this conversation and men who want to be allies, they're going to have to do the work themselves, and they're going to have to put in the effort. There is no perfect, explanation that will suddenly make it click. You have to do the work. I think it's the same way that, white women need to start doing their own emotional labor and getting on board with a more intersectional feminism. Like, we have to do the work ourselves. We can't expect someone else to hold our hand. And so I think that's the same with men. We need to hold them to that standard. And if they want to learn, they will learn. People ask me if I married some extraordinary man, and I'm like, I love him and he's great, but the only thing that is extraordinary about his transformation is that he wanted to learn.
That's really positive. I'm going to open it out now for questions from the floor. Have we got any questions?
Yes. For my question, without sounding ungrateful, but so my husband, he had a day off, so he did the housework, and I mean by doing the housework, he did the kitchen, he did a very small dust, the vacuum cleaner broke halfway through the house, and he didn't go out and buy another one. And then on the weekend, they set out to do the housework, and he's like, oh, but you don't need to do it because I've done it. And I was like, well, you did your version of the housework, which is actually not properly cleaning. So I still needed to go around and do the entire housework, even though he tried to do it himself. So how do I, without sounding ungrateful and really awful to him, say, this is really great, but you didn't do it right?
Oh, that's a good question. One of the research articles that I drew on from the book, I don't know if I actually put it in the book or not, but it was how many women would go around behind their partners and clean up after they've done a clean. And they're like, well, I don't want to hurt his ego, so I'm just going to go around and do the things that he didn't do. Yeah. But I think we need to stop being afraid of having these conversations about our shared, standards for a home, and not be so shy about it. I think that just, say hey, this is something that I do. Would you also do it? I don't think it needs to be that fraught. I hope it.
I like the way you said shared standards. That's a really good idea.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
I have a question quite similar to Gemma's. My partner is a corporate lawyer, and he obviously has much longer working hours than I do. So I'm just wondering how to broach that kind of emotional load in terms of we don't have the same amount of time in the home. So should I expect him to do his fair share, 50%, down the line? Or if he's getting back at, 10 p.m., sometimes midnight, some nights if he's on a deal, is it really fair for me to say, well, yeah, sorry, it's your turn to clean the bathroom or whatever?
So I think 50-50 is like a pipe dream. I don't think anyone's going to reach 50-50. And I don't think that's because women can never have balance. I think that it's just an unreasonable goal, especially because you are going to go through these periods of life where you're, one person needs to do a little bit more and the other person needs a little leeway. I think what is important is that the time that he is at home and the time that you do have to devote to emotional labor is more equal. So yeah, I wouldn't say expect 50-50 when one has a much more demanding schedule, but expect that they will be on when they are home and that they will put in the same amount of effort when it's possible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
I do have another. How would you suggest broaching the topic. So like, what would you suggest is like an easy way to phrase, hey, let's sit down and talk about these are the things I do and these are the things you don't do, without them getting defensive or it sounding like we're criticizing them? How would you suggest starting that conversation and some of the tools within that conversation so it doesn't turn into them being like, oh, I did it this one time, and me being like, well, I've done it 50 times. How would you suggest making it not so much a fight, but rather just a calm conversation where you both understand each other's sides?
Yeah. So one thing I love to say is that don't wait until you're like tripping over the wrapping paper box in the middle of the closet and having a meltdown. Don't wait until it gets to that boiling point. Like, be able to have a calm conversation about it. And I think one of the big things that helped me and Rob talk about it was that I was doing this research and I was talking about it from a cultural perspective, and really, asking him questions about like the way that he was raised and what sort of expectations that he saw growing up, and like we were really getting into like how we were socialized rather than doing this like, here's what you do and here's what I do and here's why it's not enough. We sort of got to that point, but we also started that conversation by talking about the different expectations that society had placed on us, the different ways we were socialized. And I think that's a much easier in than just going right to like, here's a list of things I need you to like pick it up on, because that's it doesn't generally end well. But we started having these conversations really regularly. So when I would point something out, I didn't feel like there was this pressure to get it all in one conversation. I could notice something and be like, hey, you always leave like the cabinet doors open, and this is something I never wanted to nag you about because it didn't seem worth it. But we're talking about emotional labor a lot now. Like, can you keep an eye on that and try and do it more often? And little things will add up over time if you let them. So I would just bring up the little things and not worry about them becoming a fight.
Gemma, I've got a question.
Yes.
So I'm in a slightly unusual situation in that I work full time and my husband has worked from home. So he's done that over the past 16 years and was very much like the vanguard of Dad at the school gate. So my kids have grown up knowing that Dad does a lot of that stuff. But for us, we found that at a societal level, he would still be constantly asked when he's getting a paid job, back in a business. He used to work in advertising, when he's going to do something with his life, and from quite close friends of ours, and he can't respect the decision, that we've made together, that's how we will live our life. And I feel even though a lot of those friends would be picking up their kids from school, the dads would be pulling a lot of that emotional labour, there is still obviously a big gap in society's expectation around what men do and what women do. And my question is, how do we break that down as someone who is like living that way? How do you kind of keep pushing that message and get it to be more accepted?
Yeah, so this is really, I like this question because I don't get to talk a lot about this side of it, where, where does toxic masculinity fit into this gender role that we're taking on? And, men have this really, really strong cultural pressure to do paid work outside of the home. And that was something that was really hard for my husband during the time that he was laid off and he had to take on this role of being at home full time. And I think we're quite a ways away from that cultural shift where we start seeing men and women on equal ground, and we start seeing that men can start making choices that, look different than working and shutting off emotions and not doing anything around the house, or only doing things around the house when they're asked. I think we're pretty far away from that culturally. I mean, obviously, if you have friends, like close friends, that are still asking those kind of questions. And I think the best thing to do is just to keep pushing back on it and saying, like, this is a decision that we've made. There's nothing wrong with what we're doing here. Like, why do we think that men can only fulfill this one role? Like, why do we exclude them from the whole human experience? I think that's what emotional labor really does, is it brings everyone, when it's balanced, more fully into their lives. And so I think denying men that opportunity is really it's not helping anyone. It's putting, all of that weight on women while also sectioning them off from part of their lives.
Hayley, one more question?
Yes. So my question is, when we're talking about emotional labour, women tend to be quite educated on the subject from personal experience, but there also seem to be a group of men who feel like they're educated but aren't living it out, not pulling their weight, so they can talk all about it and then 5 minutes later still ask someone to go make them a coffee, for example. How do you feel how can we broach that subject with them when they already feel like they know what we're going to talk to them about?
So how do we deal with mansplaining? That's really tough, because I think there needs to be like an openness to learn about it. And I think there's so much information out there, not just my book, but so many articles have been written on emotional labor. And I think that, my personal thing is when men start doing that, I'm just like, this right here, what you're doing right now, emotional labor. Like, I'm not shy about pointing it out. But I also have that luxury because I wrote a book on it. And you'd be surprised the amount of men that want to argue with me about it when I've written about it. But actually, you wouldn't know them would be surprised. So I think really, I would just bring it up, but I think that's a personal choice that everyone has to make with how comfortable we feel, because it's pushing cultural norms outside of the box, and I think that's difficult to do. It takes a lot of courage and bravery to start, speaking up.
Thank you so much, Gemma.
Sorry, I'm going to be
one more.
and just ask a question. In the workplace, how do we, ladies, just pull back on the emotional labour, let it go, still do our job, but move this forward?
Yes.
Well, that's a big question. So I think really setting some boundaries is the main thing. One thing that I had to do to sort of retrain myself on emotional labor, especially in regards to the email thing, I would start scanning my emails before I sent them, not to make sure they were carefully worded, but to make sure they weren't. I'm very direct, and it gets me into trouble every now and again, but I don't care, because I want that to be the norm. I want to have that be how people see, oh, well, she's sending a direct email, and I want that to become a norm that people see often. And I think we just need to start being really clear about the boundaries that we set with how much emotional labor we're going to put forward. And sometimes that's going to mean ruffling some feathers and making people uncomfortable, because everyone is going to expect your emotional labor, and they will take it from you, up until your absolute limit. So set that limit a lot closer.
I like the idea of being a boss and not a mum at work.
Yeah.
Not that I am. I'm not saying that I am. But I do think women have that tendency to try and solve things that are probably just outside the work remit because they want everyone to be happy. So that's something that I might think about a little bit more. And you can call me up on it if I try and be a mum. I think that is all the questions now, Fiona.
Yeah.
I think so much of the time when we're talking about issues such as these and at the amazing festivals that you speak at, share your story at, these are conversations that are all really driven by women and by a workforce of women, and the amplification of stories. I guess a lot of the media probably respond really well to your book and to stories like this are women driven, whether it's the face or the producers behind the scenes. So I wonder how, or whether you have any ideas on how, whether in the US, whether this is a different case, but whether there's space for bringing men into the sharing of those stories and the amplification of them in events and media and all those sorts of things.
I think there will be. I don't think that time is now. I think right now women are really finding their voices, and I think that we need to keep that at the forefront. you know, women talking about their lived experiences, like we don't need men telling us what that is. And I think we need to become comfortable with our own voice and to have that respected without men speaking on our behalf. So I think there will be a time, and I do think, you know, men and women need to have these conversations privately and to really start, you know, talking about it amongst themselves. I think men really need to have these conversations with other men. That's something that my husband does a lot with his male friends and coworkers. But I think when we're amplifying voices, we need to amplify women's voices when we're talking about women's issues. Yeah.
Any more questions? Thank you very much, Gemma. That was an amazing way to celebrate International Women's Day. It was a really thoughtful discussion, prompted lots of ideas, and we're really grateful to have you here, so thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for having me.